praying the woman's prayer. O God, creator of all life, bless the unsung lives of countless Christian women in every century who were your hands and feet, who kept alive your compassionate presence by feeding the hungry, nursing the sick, clothing the naked, comforting the sad, praying and petitioning, strengthening those in prison, teaching the stories, sowing and singing, weeping and rejoicing. Grant us the wisdom to discern our ministries in this day as our foremothers found theirs. Lead us in new and timeless forms of discipleship, and let us joyfully find our place in this procession of praise, offering our very gifts and voices together with them and Mary, the mother of our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. Again, welcome, and we are blessed to be able to hear as our presenter today, Heather Huyck, who is a member of our board, by the way. We have a special place in our heart for her today. Heather is a PhD public historian, a lifelong Episcopalian, who was deeply involved in the effort to gain Episcopal women priests. She and her mother met in Philadelphia for the Philadelphia ordination of the Philadelphia 11 on July 29th, 1974. That fall, she organized a group to support them. A year later, 4 more women were ordained in Washington, D.C. In 1976, the National Church met in Minneapolis and voted to affirm women as Episcopal priests. Encouraged by 2 anthropologists, she changed her dissertation topic, which became to celebrate a whole priesthood, the ordination of women to the Episcopal priesthood, University of Minnesota, 1981. As a historian, she worked for the National Park Service and the U.S. House of Representatives. She now lives at Collington, a senior community founded by the Episcopal Diocese of Washington, D.C. Heather, I turn this over to you.
Thank you, and thank you all very much. We have an interesting topic today, and I want to start by saying that one of the challenges for all of us is that when you're at events such as Philadelphia or Washington, I'm going to make a plea that you not only take pictures, but you save them. It's been a real challenge to be able to illustrate this the way I would like to. So 50 years ago, I was a grad student at the University of Minnesota, and I heard the Reverend Dr. Jeanette Picard preach. I was unaware of how amazing a person she was, and I invited her over for dinner, probably spaghetti. Before the end of dinner, she had me on a committee on women's ordination. And so now, if I can share my screen, I'm going to share some pictures. So we have talked about celebrating a whole priesthood. I have the original button. That became the title of my dissertation because I try to have a sense of humor. Episcopal women have had many roles over the decades. Deaconess Brown was on the back hinterland of the Navajo Reservation in 1963. Nell Hughes Boyle was a supervisor of a sewing room with the ECW, wearing not only pearls but a hat. We have all kinds of roles that we all have played, and I always want to remember that the majority of women in the Episcopal Church are lay women. But there was another generation. Starting in 1958, the Episcopal Theological Seminary in Cambridge allowed women to become seminarians there, and the woman in the middle in the back row, the Reverend Suzanne Hyatt, known as the Bishop to the Women, was one of the first students there, and really was the key strategist and organizer. So women started getting their credentials, discovering there were other women who also had calls to the ministry. And then in 1971, the Episcopal Women's Caucus organized. I found at least one article that said they were too radical for many people, which was interesting. I never thought of them as too radical. And they started getting ordained to the diaconate. Now, of course, as you think about it, each role that Episcopal women have tried to gain in the church, whether as nuns or deaconesses or deacons or lay readers or vestry members, and the really fierce one before women's ordination, deputies to General Convention, every single step was contested and fought over. And then on July 29th, 1974, at the Church of the Advocate, a black church in North Philadelphia, 11 women were ordained to the priesthood. They had come together to a church where Paul Washington was the rector. I'm trying to get rid of sound in the back, but I guess are you okay to hear it?
Yes.
Okay. Where Paul Washington was the rector, and where 4 years before they had hosted the Black Panthers. So there's been a long joke that the Black Panthers were some of the security for the ordination because there was a great deal of fear for violence, and the things that the antis said there were pretty awful. And then after the service, I should add that Alla Bozarth in the center there, two things about her. There was a plan B if the service wasn't allowed to happen. And there was a place in New Jersey. And I was told by Alla, if the service gets disrupted, your job is to get back to the car. And we will all go to New Jersey. We will need lay witnesses. I thought that was a terrible idea. I did not want it because my mother would never fit in Alla's car. So fortunately, that did not happen. It was an incredibly joyous service and a very powerful one. During that service is when Barbara got her first, Harris got her call to the priesthood, and other women recognized they had them as well. Then the House of Bishops met in an emergency meeting and declared the women were invalid. And all of you who know your sacramental theology know that sacraments require proper intention. A baby can't be ordained. Proper form, no Kool-Aid or whatever, and proper matter. And whatever arguments they ever made, the real piece was not about intention, was not about form. It was always about proper matter. Could females be proper matter? And my favorite argument being that Jesus was male, therefore all the priests must be male. To which you can argue, okay, so if Jesus had been female, does that mean only women can be priests? Which shows that absurdity. And then there was a service at Riverside in New York with Allison Cheek, shown here in the center, and then Jeanette Picard and Carter Hayward. So the three of them were there in New York, but it wasn't an Episcopal church. They then got a service at the Church of St. Stephen's and the Incarnation in Washington, D.C. Its rector, Bill Wendt, was well known for his pushing boundaries. It was the first integrated church in Washington, D.C. when, in 1968, when Martin Luther King was murdered and Washington went up in flames, Wendt invited people and had services in the church and was so well known he was out in the streets as they burned. So he decided it was important to recognize her ordination publicly and that she was functioning as a priest. Most of the women were told, no, you can't function publicly. There was a lot of private celebrations, but this was the first public in an Episcopal church. And obviously quite joyous. The bishop was not happy, Bishop Creighton, and he asked Wendt not to do it. He told Wendt not to do it, but Creighton really didn't want a crisis. He was trying to calm things down. It was known as a liberal diocese, and he was in favor, at least, of the principle of women priests, and now he had actuality, and that was a different matter. Only 4 days afterwards, presentments were brought against Wendt for disobeying his bishop's, quote, godly admonition, which was a term that got really debated during the trials, because he had allowed Alison Cheek to celebrate at his parish. In Oberlin, Peter Beebe was also tried and convicted, and he basically lost his job, and he was really at the beginning of his career. Wendt went on to doing dying ministry, and maybe if any of you were at the 1976 General Convention, he had wooden coffins that were suitable for bookshelves or wine racks until you needed it for a coffin. Wendt was found guilty in June of 75. The lay press, the secular press, thought the whole thing was ridiculous. And that was one of the issues that particularly the Mighty Eight, they were called, the 8 bishops who had women priests in their diocese, were not happy about. And so we see the kinds of statements that are being made. A great, terribly thing has happened when the majority has made it difficult. And you'll notice that the bishops and the laity were consistently more supportive of women priests than the male clergy. In Minnesota, we were celebrating the first anniversary of Philadelphia with balloons because Jeanette Picard was a balloonist who had gone into the stratosphere in 1934 and was quite famous in that role and an amazing balloonist. So we were trying to find ways to recognize their ordination and their priesthood in public without infuriating the bishop any more than he was anyway. And of course, Alla was 27, Jeanette was 79 when they were ordained, and the bishop was a little younger than Jeanette Picard, which did not help. In Washington, there were several deacons. There were these 3 deacons, plus Elizabeth Wiesner. Wiesner took a very different attitude than these 3 women. The 3 women here, Lee McGee, Betty Powell, then Rosenberg, and Alison Cheek, were working close together. They were helping each other. And in February of 75, Betty Powell said, we need to have another ordination. One ordination is not enough. It's not real. It's not a crisis enough. We've got to do more. And so that's where we begin to move toward the Washington ordination. But it's important to understand the context of the trials, you might say the trials and tribulations, or in this case, the trials and ordinations that were going on here. So on September 7th, 1975, at St. Stephen's and the Incarnation, 4 more women were ordained. At the time, it was primarily Black church. With white flight, they had left. But it now is a bilingual church with Hispanic and English speakers there. Some of the people who are behind the scenes but crucial, not only Alison Cheek, who I think part of it was she was, as a married woman, she had a husband who was bringing in some of the family income. She was less vulnerable than some of the single women. She also had a certain energy and determination at the same time. She was, for a long time, an Australian citizen here on a green card, so she was at risk for that. They all had amazing risks they were taking. Cheek and Anderson knew each other from Virginia Theological Seminary and were good friends. Anderson and Wendt had gone around the diocese teaching the clergy how to get used to the new, quote unquote, 1979 prayer book. Wendt was known for his outrageous courage, so it all came together and made some sense. As you all know, in order to have an ordination, you need to have a bishop doing it. You need to have a place to do it, people who are seeking it, and then you have the background players. So here we have the Right Reverend George Barrett, who had resigned as the Bishop of Rochester, New York, over a sexual scandal. He had become involved with the wife of a priest and had to resign and move to California. And he was concerned that he would be okay for the women who were getting ordained, and he certainly was, and they were very grateful to his support. He had been involved in 1966 on a major report about women's ordination. The church had studied this since 1919. And so he talks about having been changed in his attitudes by being on that committee and making a difference there. I've mentioned Bill Went, and St. Stephen's and the Incarnation sometimes refers to themselves as SSI. So I think that's some more Anglican humor. So we have Allison Palmer, Lee McGee, Betty Powell, Diane Tickell. They finally tracked her down in Alaska. That's where she lived, but it wasn't easy to find out where she was. And Phyllis Edwards. Phyllis Edwards in 1965 was a deaconess who the famous Bishop Pike had recognized as being a member of the diaconate as a deacon. And at that point, all hell had broken loose. And the House of Bishops were going after Pike big time. And then he goes off to Israel to go discover things and dies. So Pike is out of the scene. But Phyllis Edwards had been a deacon for many years. She was in Chicago. When she let her bishop, Bishop Montgomery of Chicago, know she wanted to go to Washington, Montgomery did two things. He promised her all kinds of wonderful futures if she didn't, and he promised her all kinds of retribution if she did. So she withdrew. She did not go. Once that happened, he never paid any more attention to it. She did not become ordained to the priesthood until 1980. And it's some of the many ways that different people suffered and struggled to make this happen. In Washington, Bishop Creighton and also Bishop John Walker, who was the first Black bishop of Washington, both struggled with how to be pastoral, but also how to be firm as to what was going on. And they kind of go back and forth. Finally, in April of 75, Bishop Creighton announced there would be no more ordinations of anybody, male or female. And later he was caught apologizing, saying it would be really hard on the male deacons who had been deacons for more than 6 months, to which the women said, well, what about us? And the women, both lay and clergy, were doing a lot of protests in the Washington area at this point. Another key supporter in all of this is Kyle McGee, who was Lee McGee's husband. He was on the staff at St. Stephen's and the Incarnation, as was Allison Cheek, and he was also at Georgetown University. And here we have a sort of homegrown version of the ordination service bulletin. And I want to turn for a minute and talk about the women and talk about who they were. So the first person is Allison Palmer. She was a diplomat with the Department of State. She was in Vietnam. She saved a man's life in Congo. She's in the middle of rebellions and revolutions. She's no wimp at all. And she has 2 lawsuits she's notorious for. First, she sued the Department of State for her own mistreatment. When she got $25,000, she turned around and sued the Department of State again on behalf of all women, and really made a lot of policy changes in the process. She was able to study for the priesthood in the Diocese of Washington, not at a seminary, which, if you think about her rest of her career, was quite impossible. But she was famous for wearing her clerical collar around in the State Department and really ministering to people there. She had St. Columba's, which is where the trial was held, as her sponsoring parish. And she details in gruesome detail the problems she had with the rector there. Lee McGee, later Lee McGee Street, was the first female chaplain at American University in Washington for 8 years, which is a big deal. I've mentioned about her husband. She then got her master's in social work as a therapist, became a professor at Yale Divinity School, which is where she'd gone to seminary, and also moved to New Haven, and really was incredible because as she was doing this, she was dealing with increasing blindness, and right as she died, her favorite seeing eye dog also died, and the poignancy is quite powerful, as is the title of her book, Wrestling with the Patriarchs. which is ostensibly and is in fact about how to preach and how to use the Bible to understand, because all of this involved a complete reconsideration of the Bible and of our theology. But I think it also was a comment on what she spent her career doing. Betty Rosenberg Powell went to Virginia Theological Seminary. At first, Nancy Hatch Huyck, who was with the Philadelphia 11, was there with her, but then Huyck went off to be with her husband, and Powell, then Rosenberg, was left by herself and talks about how very lonely it was. Her sponsoring parish in Southwest DC was fine, but after she was ordained, she had very bad experiences in the two parishes, and she had hoped to be a parish priest. But then the House of Bishops came out with an anti-gay statement, which broke her heart. And she says, I came out to the rector, and he then fired her the next morning. She went on to have, eventually, a career focus in pastoral counseling. The other woman in Washington was Diane Tickell, and I wanted to share a little bit because people, I think, know much less about Alaska and about the Episcopal Church in Alaska. She was in Cordova, Alaska, which is a fishing village at the end of the railroad line that leads up to incredible copper mines. Millions today, billions of dollars worth of copper. And the Episcopal Church wanted to have a place for miners and railroad men to go besides brothels and bars. And so they built this building, which is a big deal for the situation in Alaska. And because the church was called, it hadn't been built yet, but the church was called St. George's, and the paint on the railroad was red. Obviously, this was named the Red Dragon. I mean, what else could you name it? And so on Sundays, there was an altar lowered from the rafters. Otherwise, there was a piano and books and coffee, and most important in Alaska, warmth. So there's the Red Dragon then and today. And Tickell lived in the Red Dragon after she was ordained priest. There's not that much space in there, but there's more than it looks from this picture. Tickell had been born in Massachusetts, gone to Smith College, and then in 1944, remember, statehood's not till 59, moved to Alaska with her husband, Bud Tickell. And in those days, when somebody came to Alaska, either by boat or less often by plane, the newspaper actually named somebody was coming. It was that big a deal. She then, after her husband died, went back east, got her MDiv in Cambridge, got herself ordained a deacon, and would like to have gone to Philadelphia. But Philadelphia, she was broke financially, and there was a transition with the bishop, and she said, this is just not a good idea. So she was thrilled when they caught up with her and brought her to Washington. So she's the fourth person. And here we have the four ordinands and the bishop. We don't know what they were laughing about, but they clearly were quite happy and getting ready, although at least I think it was Allison Palmer said, I never was as scared in my life as when I knelt to be ordained. And others had dreamed that there was a man in the back of the church coming to shoot them. So the fear factor was quite genuine and powerful, but again, it certainly did not deter them. And here we have, thanks to St. Stephen's and the Incarnation finding this, a picture of the service itself. You can see deacons way over on the left, and you can see that the ordination is there. And if you look very hard, you'll see Bishop Barrett in the center. Washington was really important for several reasons. The Philadelphia 11 were no longer unique. There were now 15 women priests, which meant more visibility and more targets, and they certainly were sometimes targeted. It meant that the Philadelphia ordinations were not a fluke. They couldn't be dismissed as just one and done. And if you think about your geometry, if you have a point, one dot, it's just a dot. But if you have two dots, then you start to see direction. And that's what the second ordination did. It showed direction, that there would be more priests, more bishops, and the church was going to change. And Sue Hyatt, who really is amazing, called it critically important that the ordinations would continue until the church acted. Those who supported the women priests did not believe that General Convention was necessary. And so when I say that General Convention affirmed women's ordination, it's because those of us who supported Philadelphia and Washington said, they are priests, that's it. And we were waiting for the rest of the church to catch up, and the rest of the church had to work through the theology, the tradition. Does this start to sound familiar? And also the personalities. And then in January of 76, and remember, the whole process of church trials and appeals and so on are going on during the same process. So in January of 76, we're now got the General Convention staring us in the face. The bishop is expected and directed to admonish Bill Wendt. And in the basement of the Washington Cathedral, Wendt is down there, the bishop facing him, and many people from St. Stephen and the Incarnation congregation are there as witnesses and support. And Wendt said that he kept his hands clasped firmly behind his back because he wanted to stand as tall as possible while the bishop read a long and not very friendly statement, which you can get from the archives in the diocese if you so please. And I want to say that one of the main reasons that people went to Washington to be ordained, there was a core of people there, but also those people did not believe that Minneapolis in the 1976 General Convention was going to vote positively. Not only was it not necessary, but they didn't think it would happen. There were three groups working on this: the caucus, which really then focused on education; the National Coalition for Ordination to the Priesthood and Episcopacy was founded in 1974. They had two roles that they chose. One was the vote. They were doing old-fashioned lobbying. They were tracking numbers. They were paying attention, especially with our weird voting system. And they were not interested in dealing with the women priests. They saw them as distraction, disruption, and could jinx the whole thing. This was a real crisis of camaraderie. The other thing the coalition cared about was the presiding bishop, who said at the time, I'm not going to make a decision. I'm going to be neutral, which if you're a leader is sort of strange, but okay. And they kind of babysat the presiding bishop. He had come from Mississippi. There'd been contention about his election because of his racial attitudes, and he was not particularly friendly to the women either. The other group was Women's Ordination Now, or WON, sort of a turn on now, and they were specifically focused on supporting the women priests who had just been ordained, the 15 women. And in Minnesota, we had two of them. So we were the Minnesota Committee for Women's Ordination Now, which is where the button came from. And that's what we were wearing in 1976. And after the vote passed, we joke that Mick won. Here you can see that there was a Eucharist at the beginning of the General Convention. The Labor Day weekend before General Convention, we spent our time and our phone bills calling all over the country trying to get bishops willing to come join us. And at that point, we were able to get 3. And that was a big deal to get 3. We had everybody renew their ordination vows. They did Eucharist. The women priests were there. Again, we had to walk a very fine line there. Meanwhile, Ala Bozarth was having deputies to General Convention to her Wisdom House chapel, and we were all busy having our own Eucharist, but very private about it. I want to also add that you can sort of see there the beginning of Roman Catholic prayer and fast, sponsored by Minnesota St. John's Community. And so the Roman Catholic women were dedicating fasting and prayer for us. There was a woman from Now. I was trying to find her a worthy job, and I asked her to do 94 theses on women's ordination. I wanted it on the cathedral door. However, one of the people in our group, in the MIC1 group's father, had refinished that door, and she went nuts. So if you ever look in Time magazine, you will see a picture of a woman with a crab mallet affixing 94 Theses onto the convention door. So those are the kinds of things you negotiate as you're making these things happen. There was a man who thought the night before the vote on the ordination, he would write all the theology up. We said, that's fine, but we don't need you tonight doing that. He had many other severe problems. I'll leave it at that. So the actual vote, and again, it's affirming women can be priests, not permitting, passed the House of Deputies, clergy 60 with 58 needed, lay 64, 57 needed. Oh, only 2 votes could have made a difference. That's scary, y'all. And then a couple days later, the House of Bishops voted and it passed 60-40. The good news is it was 60% in favor. But if you think about it, 40% is a pretty significant percentage on a vote. And so the people against it was a very high number. It helps us understand some of the things that happened afterwards. And then the National Coalition had a wonderful dance and went home. And those of us with the 15 women priests were like, wait a minute, there's more to be done. Because of Bishop Vogel of West Missouri had forced a report, and the compromise was that the ordinations for these women were, quote, new word, completable. Interesting word, y'all. And so he said completable, and they left it at that. And then what he really wanted was a conditional ordination, which the women and some of their bishops saw as terrible theology. He was making a parallel with conditional baptism, but women priests are much more aware of everything than babies. It was appalling. And they wanted a choice between conditional ordination to keep him happy or a public event. And then they voted, they took out the public event, and it was only conditional. And those of us with supporting the women priests were quite upset, and they were even more so when it was conditional only, because we knew they wouldn't accept it. And then, as people explain it, there was a telegram from Pat Merchant of the National Coalition saying, please, please don't do this. Give us our public event back. And others say they heard the Holy Spirit. Either way, both ways, the bishops voted again, and it became, again, alternative 2, conditional ordination or public event. There were no conditional ordinations. However, Bishop Vogel kept Katrina Swanson basically prisoner until 1977, when she went to New Jersey. So it was pretty difficult and not much fun, y'all. And then on January 2nd, 1977, the fully legal women were getting ordained to the priesthood, and also most of the 15, not all, became regularized. I always date the first legal woman priest as Pat Merchant because she was so crucial. Everybody knew her. She worked herself to pieces on it as co-chair. And so I really think, in fairness and justice, she should be recognized. She says no. The first woman priest was Jeanette Picard, who was the first woman ordained. This is in the Episcopal Church, because she was the oldest. Jeanette was 79 when she was ordained. She had told her mother at age 68 she wanted to be ordained. And then there were many more women coming on, and then bishops, starting with Barbara Harris. I want to end with the fact that a year later, the House of Bishops, the presiding bishop, tells the House of Bishops the following: he did not believe that women can be priests any more than they can be fathers or husbands, which is just like, say what? And that's why we need to recognize something the coalition did that was not appreciated at the time. They had babysat the presiding bishop. And here we have Diane Tickell on the right with an Alaska-style wedding. The ring bearer was the husky you see in the center. Tickell was known for her great love for people, for animals, and for her light as air turkey stuffing. Mm-hmm. But she was known as just a very amazing, determined person. And then the 40th anniversary came, and one of the best quotes I found is from Patricia Hanloss, who was involved. And again, this July 29th, it will be 50 years. In my humble opinion, this is the most extraordinary event in modern church history. Life-changing for the Western Church. How honored was I to share in the richness of the vote after years of being separated out due to my gender. Thank you to my friends and colleagues who made this happen and continue to make acceptance of women priests happen. The door is open and God holds our hands and hearts as we journey down a road that has at times been rough indeed. Grace will see us through. There have been many quotes, but I think that's one of my favorites. And then last September, all of the women of the 15 who were able to travel came to the grand opening at the Church of the Advocate of the film, The Philadelphia 11. If you haven't seen it, it's streaming on March 8th, and we are setting up various showings around the country and really want everybody to see it. And it is adamantly not only for Episcopal women, for Episcopal clergy women, for Episcopalians, etc. It is a movie made for everyone with a lot of interviews and a lot of archival footage. And here you can see all of them, but the woman in orange is Margot Guernsey, the producer of that film. Everybody else is one of the original women, and missing of those still alive are Alison Palmer, who lives on Cape Cod and says she's 91, Ola Bozarth, who's in Oregon and doesn't travel. And then in Washington last fall, they had a grand viewing of that film, and the ordained women gathered together. And then you can see I kind of pulled out Betty Powell, who will be here at Collington in a couple of weeks. And you can see the fruits of the labor. And now we can celebrate a whole priesthood. And I do mean to celebrate in both senses of the word, and a whole priesthood, both in the sense of male and female, but also a whole priesthood, the priesthood of all believers. So thank you all. And I'm happy to take some questions.
Okay, if you all have any questions, would you please write them in the chat? I had one that I would ask Heather, when you talked about getting on the phones before the vote in 76, and you had 3 bishops that said yes. Could you tell us who those 3 were?
One was Coleman McGee, one was Kim Myers, and I keep trying to find the other one. My problem is that many years ago, because I'm a historian and I care about documentation, I gave most of my collection, my archive, to Smith College. They're all up at Sophia Smith, and I'm not. So if anybody's near Smith College, you can probably go ask them. I can probably figure out which file folder. But we know it was McGee and we know it was Meyer, and Meyer had gone back and forth. And I do remember my mother saying that we had really hit a home run in the sense that we had such a range of the Episcopal Church as those 3 bishops.
I'm sad to hear that Bishop Huyck didn't make it till the end.
Yeah, he didn't.
Yeah.
He didn't, and he was being abused. And I should say that in Chicago, the 3 bishops plus Bishop Ramos from Costa Rica were all basically being mistreated and beat up by their brother bishops. And that the trials, they couldn't put the women on trial because the rules are different if you're clergy or lay. So they would have had to recognize implicitly that they were clergy.
Yeah.
And so they went after the men instead. So I just feel it's so important when we tell that. As a historian, I care about telling the whole story. And it's so important that we talk about everybody, and a strategy in the church is so important that we recognize that this is an opportunity with the 50th anniversary, that here's a positive, wonderful story about the church, and we really should be using that to bring other people in.
You bet.
So I see a question. What do you think is the work ahead? Well, part of it is absolutely telling our stories of liberation and consciousness. I was talking to one of the women recently, and she said, I cannot go to church. She said, the language of the prayer book is so sexist and so exclusionary, I can't do it. And I'm going to talk here at Collington, which was founded by the Episcopal Diocese of Washington, right outside DC. I'm going to be giving a presentation. It's Women's History Month. Why I pray our Creator art. I don't do fathers, haven't for 50 years. And Olive Bozarth has an amazing service that I use when I can. And my husband, when we were getting married, said, well, he wanted art. So the male rector who married us, there was a woman as well, said, okay, who's Creator art? And that's how we do it.
Okay.
What's the worst penalty they faced? Would have been being thrown out of the priesthood, which would have meant not only their callings, but also their livelihood. And 2 of the women ended up leaving, and you'll see that in the film. I don't want to spoil that. Are there age something on seeking the diaconate? I don't know. I don't think so. Age restrictions today. That's a good question. One of the things I love about the Episcopal Church, and shows so much in this story, is how it varies not only by parish, but by diocese.
Right.
There are probably dioceses that would say, sure, come on in. And there are others that would say, you've got to be kidding.
That's right. I think that's the best answer, because some bishops absolutely will not ordain old people, but others will.
And there's a huge group of sort of second career women that are becoming priests. So such as Diane Tickell, in effect, although it was because she had to wait, but there are a number of them. How is Creator art spelled? Well, you've got the Creator, and then ART, as in the way other people say the Lord's Prayer.
Right.
And it's worked for 30 years. Well, no, we're not at 50, we're at 30. Yes, I believe that's correct. Now, as Joan Gunderson would know. So yes, the women, depending on the diocese, there were women who had to go elsewhere, and there were women who kept waiting, and then, there were people who left. But I should add, the number of male Episcopal priests who actually left and became Roman Catholic was pitifully small, and the number as a percentage of Episcopalians that left to form other churches was surprisingly small. What we have lost, as other churches have, is the ability to bring in younger generations, starting with my goddaughters and so on. So I think that's the challenge. I think having inclusive language and focusing on justice and love would make a big difference. And it breaks my heart that the Episcopal Church seems to be struggling.
As Heather was saying, if you have and can get the opportunity to see this film that Margot Guernsey has created, please do. We're showing it here in Swanee this coming Monday. If anybody's near Swanee, it will. And then the 8th, did you say, is when they're doing the online viewing?
They are, and it's $10, folks. Mm-hmm. So you can go to, I would Google the Philadelphia 11 and look around, and it's there. It's not a problem. There were also evangelical priests. Yes, there were definitely evangelical. It was sort of both ends were opposed, and they came up with various arguments. I want to add that there were some interesting sacrifices that the proponents made. One of my favorites was there was a woman working for the coalition, and I'm going to protect all the guilty parties here. For 2 years, this is mid-70s, for 2 years, she never left the house without wearing her girdle because she wanted to present as ladylike as possible. None of these rabble-rousing younger women. She was going to be proper. So there was the girdle piece. There was a bishop who really wasn't doing anything, and we couldn't figure out why. He was liberal on a lot of things and a good guy, and he wasn't at all active. And when I was doing my research, I asked his wife what happened. And she said, well, we had a shower with a glass door. Then one morning, when he was in the shower, I put my hands on either side of the door and I said, dear, it's time to talk about women priests. And that's when he changed. That's when he realized. So I think that's an important piece. And, married clergy makes a difference. And then there was another woman, a younger woman, who never had worn makeup. And when she was at the 76th General Convention, that was the first time that she started wearing makeup because, again, some of the women were trying to present themselves as proper ladies. I wouldn't be surprised at the largest number of men entering our second career as well. And I think, yes, we can add more expansive language and, get rid of some of the male language and add a lot more female. I mean, as you hear from this account, we wouldn't have women's ordination in the Episcopal Church without a whole bunch of very determined men. So it's not a one sex thing, which is why I get frustrated when things are presented for the women clergy only. I'm like, wait a minute, it should be for everybody. Right. And I can't imagine, I would not want to be admonished by my bishop. That doesn't sound like fun to me. What more can we say in the energy and the faith and the challenges? Since I was right there for so much history. It was luck and good fortune that I was there in front of that, that I experienced that. It was also, I understood immediately at some level that what they were doing was important. I had asked to be an acolyte as a teenager and was told I was a girl. I responded to my rector, I knew that, but I wasn't allowed to be an acolyte. I think we sometimes get opportunities that don't immediately seem to be opportunities, that you have to just say, okay, what is this about? And keep following along. And it can be some amazing things or it can be total dead ends. But there are times that I say quite often that as a historian, that's my calling. And I think that it's important that we all think about and recognize our callings. So I think I was simply following my calling and it fell together in some amazing ways. And I'm very grateful that it did, but it also took a lot of work. Every Tuesday when I was a graduate student, and this is again in the 70s, I would not wear my blue jeans and my pants, but I would put on a nice skirt and go to the cathedral. I had long hair in those days. I once went to a meeting with the bishop getting ready for General Convention, and I had put my hair up and had it very properly in a bun. And the bishop turned to me, and he this is in Minnesota, and he was perplexed. And he said, "What do women want?" And the answer I did not give him was, speaking on behalf of 3 billion women. And I said, well, I think we want, justice, peace, and love, basically, and women priests. But I thought it was an absurd question. And I remember I walked out of that meeting I said, Bishop, I am so sorry. I have another commitment. I have to leave, which was true. But it was to go to a movie with my boyfriend. And I walked out of there pulling the bobby pins out from my hair. And so came down and got in my VW Bug and drove off. So there was a certain amount of performance, as we now say. And yes, there's very much the divine feminine, and of course, Sophia and Shekinah and so on. There's a whole tradition of the female in terms of the Holy Spirit. Yes, Joan, that was the Bishop McNary. Bishop McNary would write these horrible letters to Jeanette Picard. And she would share them with us. And then when I was doing my research, I started reading some of the letters that she wrote him. And they were a pair. However, I defended my dissertation. Alla and Phil were both there. It's nothing like having your primary sources walk into your defense. I knew I couldn't go see Jeanette, who was dying, before I defended. I didn't have that much energy in life. And so I went to Jeanette's hospital immediately afterwards. And we, as usual, argued about St. Paul. And then she said, I'm not going to see you again. I love you. I will see you in the next life. Goodbye. And so I walked out of that hospital room and cried, but also felt empowered. And I felt that was her blessing and her sending me forth to keep working. Could I tell one or two characteristics on person and research was seen? Yes, all these women felt they had calls. The calls were not only to the priesthood, but many things. They were all tailored to the individual in interesting ways. And they also had determination. And the women who succeeded had a lot of support in their families, their friends, their communities. The women, and there were many women who were lost in the process. We need to realize how many got lost and reach out to those women too. And so I think some of us were lucky. Obviously, I had family support, and others got lost. And again, I think it's important to do that. Has anybody collected the music and prayers? Well, Alla has a service, and I think sometime maybe we as a group could do it online somehow.
Mm-hmm.
The music is documented in the services. I know that Allison Palmer wanted Ode to Joy at theirs. I know the first hymn at Philadelphia, quite appropriately, was Come Labor On, which was written to encourage women missionaries by women. So we know the music. We have parts of the sermons. What we don't have is many non-commercial photographs. And to get one of the pictures for here was $150. So really asking people for, go scrounge in your scrapbook and let's get those saved. And when you have these kinds of activities, make sure that there are people besides the press. And the press did an amazing job of covering us. The woman in the Washington Post who covered us, Marjorie Heyer, actually became an Episcopalian in the process.
Oh, wow.
But I think it's important to recognize our ongoing job of documentation. So as you see things, there's a lot there and there's a lot missing. And
I'm very impressed, Heather, also that we must never forget the men who helped. Bill went, what he went through, and he was upfront in support, but it I'm sure did a toll on him too.
Yes, it did. It took a toll on everybody. And, I think it basically ended Peter Beebe's, at that point, he looked like a rising star career.
Yeah.
And, Bishop Ramos was just plain beat up from Costa Rica. And he was an amazing man. And, one of the things that was weird was I actually was at his consecration. So go figure. So I think the thing is we need to encourage other people. We need to let non-Episcopal women know what this is about and why it's so important. And yes, there were many who threw themselves under the bus, and many more who were thrown under the bus, I think is another way to say it. So anyway, how about one more question and then we'll close this off. How can we support? Oh, good question. The first thing is we owe them fasting and prayer. The second thing is if you know a group of nuns who are available to see the Philadelphia 11, I would encourage you to pay for it or help them. They will be shown in Milwaukee with some school sisters of Notre Dame, but I think it's important to, and that gives them maybe some terror, but also some hope. And I think it's really important as you're talking to male Roman Catholic priests and anybody else to point out what a difference it makes and how joyful it is and how appropriate it is. And things can change, and they have changed, but it ain't easy. When we got married, we had two Roman Catholic women, both nuns, and we asked them to do the chalice, which is what priests usually do. We knew exactly what we were doing, and they knew we knew, and we knew they knew. And one of them said she wanted to do it, but didn't want to turn out on the cover of National Catholic Reporter for doing it. She's since died, so it's pretty safe to talk about her. And the wedding rehearsal, they were both like this. And the actual wedding, they were like giving that chalice out like they'd done it their whole lives. So, ways to recognize Roman Catholic sisters are important. And all the others, the Baptists as well, all the people who are thrown out. And, Anglicans are good at bringing people in. We need to keep them and bring them.
Well, thank you so much, Heather. This has been just wonderful. And our time is about up, and I want to invite you all to join us again next week at this time when Tula Lacey will talk about Marguerite Lebrun, a founding member of discovered 4 slaves that this enslaved people had been overlooked, and she's going to let us know about them. I would invite anybody who might feel the call to join us as members of the Episcopal Women's History Project. That was on the communication that you got for coming to this meeting, and we would love to have you as part of our cohort. So we shall see you next week, and invite your friends, and see if you can find a viewing of the Philadelphia 11 documentary and take a look. It's a powerful film and well worth it, and it's important that we continue to tell the story. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.